The door swung open before Ruth Callahan even had the chance to knock a second time, and the two children standing in the frame looked up at her with eyes that stopped her heart cold. They were not startled. They were not shy. They did not look at her the way children look at strangers who arrive unannounced on a dusty Thursday afternoon in Redemption, Texas, in the late autumn of 1882. They looked at her the way children look at someone they have been drawing pictures of in their minds for a very long time, and she had only come to ask about a room. The girl, who could not have been more than 7, had braids the color of dark honey and a steady gaze that belonged on a woman 3 times her age. The boy beside her was perhaps 9, with broad shoulders already hinting at the man he would become, and he had his hands clasped behind his back as though he were presenting himself formally. "You are here about the room," the girl said. It was not a question. Ruth stood on the porch of the 2-story house on the edge of town, with her single leather traveling bag hanging from her fingers, and the dust of the Kishom Trail still caught in the folds of her dark blue dress, and she could not speak for a full 3 seconds because something in her chest had just cracked open like dry earth splitting under a summer sky. "I am," she finally managed. "My name is Ruth Callahan. I saw the notice posted at the general store." "We know who you are," the boy said, as calmly as a judge pronouncing a verdict. Ruth felt the hair rise on the back of her neck. She had arrived in Redemption less than 2 hours ago. She had spoken to exactly 3 people: the station master, the woman at the general store who had pointed her toward the notice board, and the elderly man sweeping the boardwalk outside the barber shop who had given her directions to this address on Cottonwood Lane. None of them could have sent word ahead. There was no telegraph line on this end of town. The children could not know her name, and yet— "How do you know that?" she asked carefully. The girl looked at her brother. The brother looked at the girl. Some conversation passed between them that required no words at all. The language of children who have survived something together and built a private world in the aftermath. "Papa described you," the boy said finally. Ruth's traveling bag hit the porch boards with a soft thud. "I beg your pardon." He said a woman with red hair and a blue dress and trouble behind her eyes would come to the door before the first frost, the girl said. "He said we should let her in." Ruth Callahan stood on that porch with the cold October wind pulling at the loose strands of her auburn hair, and felt with absolute certainty that she had either walked into a trap or into the single most significant moment of her life. She was not yet sure which was worse, because she had her own secrets. She had her own hidden motives for being in Redemption, Texas. And if this man, this Marcus Atkins, whose name was printed in neat block letters at the bottom of that room-to-let notice, already knew she was coming, then either he was far more dangerous than she had anticipated, or the universe was operating by rules she did not yet understand. She picked up her bag. She squared her shoulders, and she walked through the door. To understand why Ruth Callahan had been running for 6 weeks before she arrived at that door, you had to go back to San Antonio, to a courtroom, to a man named Gerald Whitmore, and to the moment her entire life had been dismantled by a single document she was never meant to find. Ruth had been 28 years old and teaching school in San Antonio for 4 years, having come there from Missouri after her mother died and her father's second marriage had made clear to her that she was surplus in that house. She had built a careful, orderly life. She had a room above the milliner's shop on Crockett Street. She had 32 students who called her Miss Callahan and who were, some of them, beginning to read. She had a small savings account at the First National Bank of San Antonio, and the particular kind of quiet contentment that comes not from happiness exactly, but from the absence of active misery. Then Gerald Whitmore had walked into the school on a Tuesday afternoon in early September, and he had smiled at her across the rows of children bent over their slates, and she had made the catastrophic mistake of smiling back. Gerald was the kind of man who knew how to present himself. He was a land attorney, 35 years old, well-dressed, well-spoken, the sort of man whose boots were always polished and whose handshake carried the weight of respectability. He had courted her properly, with afternoon calls and Saturday rides and flowers sent to the school on her birthday. He had spoken about the future in terms that sounded like a man building something rather than acquiring something. What she had not known, what she had been forbidden from knowing by a careful architecture of omission and misdirection, was that Gerald Whitmore had a dark past that was not past at all. It was ongoing. It was thriving. It had a wife in Austin and a second set of books at his law office, and a scheme involving fraudulent land deeds for Apache territories that had already sent 3 men to early graves, 2 of whom had been federal land surveyors whose deaths had been ruled accidents. Ruth had found the documents by accident. She had gone to his office on a Wednesday evening to leave a book he had lent her, and his clerk had not been there, and the door had been unlocked, and the folder had been sitting open on the desk. She had not meant to read it, but she had seen her own name at the top of a letter, and the human impulse to read your own name in a document not addressed to you is older than civilization and considerably more powerful than good judgment. The letter was addressed to a man named Cole Briggs in Laredo. It detailed, in the bureaucratic language of men who discuss criminal enterprise as though it were ordinary commerce, how Gerald intended to use Ruth's status as a schoolteacher, her clean reputation, her lack of family connections in Texas, to front a land purchase that would allow him to claim federal teaching land grants for which he had forged 3 sets of signatures. She was not to know her role. She was to believe she was investing in a small school building with money he had told her he was holding for her. The letter called her the unwitting instrument. It discussed her as a tool with a name. She had replaced the folder exactly as she had found it. She had left the book on the clerk's desk. She had walked out into the San Antonio evening and kept walking for 4 blocks before she stopped and vomited against the wall of the livery stable on Commerce Street. Then, because Ruth Callahan was not a woman who collapsed under the weight of betrayal without first making a plan, she had gone home, packed what she could carry, taken every dollar from her savings account at first opening the next morning, and boarded the northbound stage before Gerald Whitmore arrived at the law office and found his letter exactly as she had left it, with one significant difference. She had taken the copy he had made for his own records and folded it very carefully into the lining of her traveling bag. She did not know yet what she would do with it, but she understood instinctively that knowledge was the only currency worth carrying when you were running from a man who had already used federal fraud as a casual business strategy. She had gone to Austin first, then west to Abilene, when she discovered that Gerald had contacts in Austin whose loyalty she could not gauge. From Abilene she had come south on the cattle road toward Redemption, following a rumor from a woman at a stage stop who had mentioned the town as one where a person could disappear quietly and rebuild slowly, because it was new enough that nobody's history had arrived there yet. And now she was standing in the front hallway of a house that smelled of pine resin and fresh bread, and something she could not name that was neither of those things, something warm and slightly dangerous, like sun on open ground, and the 2 children were watching her with their unsettling knowing eyes, and at the far end of the hallway a door opened, and Marcus Atkins walked in from the kitchen with flour on his hands. He was not what she expected. She had constructed a mental image from the notice and the children, something weather-beaten and taciturn, the standard-issue widower of the frontier. What she got was a man of about 33, lean but broad across the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the particular color of deep river water, that dark greenish-brown that holds things in it. He had flour on his hands and a dishcloth thrown over one shoulder, and an expression that was working very hard to appear neutral and was not entirely succeeding. He stopped when he saw her. Not an ordinary stop, not the polite pause of a man greeting a prospective tenant. A stop that happened somewhere behind the ribcage, a full-body hesitation, as though he had come around a corner and found a cliff edge. "Miss Callahan," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that had spent years in open spaces and had absorbed some of that quality. "Mr. Atkins," she said, Your children said you were expecting me. I put out a notice, he said carefully. I was expecting someone. They used my name. He looked at his daughter. His daughter looked back at him with the expression of a child who has done nothing wrong and is prepared to defend that position through any interrogation. He looked at his son. His son studied the floor with sudden deep interest. Clara, Marcus said quietly, what did you tell Miss Callahan? The truth, Clara said, with the specific tonality of a 7-year-old who has discovered that the truth is technically a shield. Elias, Marcus said. We only said what you said, Elias offered, which was not quite a defense but was at least geographically adjacent to one. Marcus wiped the flour from his hands onto the cloth at his shoulder and turned back to Ruth with an expression that was now so carefully composed, it was almost more alarming than whatever had been there before. Why don't you come and see the room, he said, and I'll explain what I can. The room was on the 2nd floor at the back of the house, with a window that faced east across the scrubland toward a line of cottonwood trees along a dry creek bed. It was a good-sized room for a boarding house, with a real bed rather than a cot, a washstand with a blue ceramic basin, a small writing desk, and a cast-iron stove in the corner that was already laid with wood. You laid a fire, Ruth said. She was standing by the window. She was not looking at him. She was watching the scrubland and keeping her voice level and trying to assess whether this situation qualified as a trap. October nights are cold, Marcus said from the doorway. I lay fires in every occupied room at the start of October. The room is not yet occupied. I was optimistic, he said. She turned around then. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed and that river water gaze fixed on her face, and she felt something she had been suppressing since San Antonio rise up without permission, something that had nothing to do with the documents in her bag or the man she was hiding from or any of the careful rational calculus of the past 6 weeks. It was simpler and older than all of that. Why did your children know my name? She asked. And I would like the real answer, Mr. Atkins, not the diplomatic one. He was quiet for a moment. The wind pushed at the window glass in its frame. Somewhere downstairs, Clara was singing something to herself in a small, certain voice. 3 weeks ago, Marcus said slowly, Elias came in from school with a drawing he had made. He told me he had dreamed about a woman who was going to come to our door and that he had tried to draw her. The woman in the drawing had red hair. He paused. I told him that was interesting, but that we did not put too much stock in dreams. Then 2 days ago he told me her name was Ruth, just her first name. I do not know how he knew that. I cannot explain it to you, and I will not try to invent an explanation that fits. He met her eyes steadily. I put the notice up anyway because I needed the rent money, and because I decided I was not going to let my 9-year-old's dream change my practical decisions. But when you walked through the door, I will admit that I felt something I cannot explain either. Ruth looked at him for a long moment. Are you telling me this to unsettle me? She asked. Because I need to tell you plainly that I am not easily unsettled, and if this is some manner of trick, it will not produce whatever effect you are hoping for. It is not a trick, he said. There was something in his voice that she recognized, not because she had heard it from him before, but because she knew the sound of a person who is too tired to bother with anything but the truth. I have 2 children and a farm that is struggling and a boarding house that has had 1 tenant in 8 months. I'm not playing games with you, Miss Callahan. I barely have the energy for the games that life is already playing with me. She almost smiled at that. She stopped herself. What happened to your wife? She asked. It was abrupt, possibly rude, but she needed to know the shape of the grief in this house before she decided whether to stay inside it. Fever, he said. 2 years ago last spring. Her name was Anne. She was a good woman and an even better mother, and I miss her differently every single day depending on what the day asks of me. He said it flatly, not with performance, the way a man states a fact he has made his peace with even though the peace is imperfect and ongoing. She would have wanted me to rent the room. How do you know that? Because she was practical and I am not always, he said. And because she knew that a house with only grief in it is not a good house for children. Ruth turned back to the window. She was pressing her thumbnail against the side of her forefinger, a habit she had when she was thinking hard, and she made herself stop. "The rate on the notice," she said. $3 a month, meals included. Breakfast and supper," he said. "You manage your own midday. I will need to find work." "Miss Patterson at the schoolhouse is looking for help," he said. "She mentioned it at the church social 2 weeks ago. Her assistant left to get married." Ruth felt the particular sharpness of that information, because it was exactly what she needed, and it had been delivered without her asking. She thought about the documents in her bag. She thought about Gerald Whitmore, who was by now aware that she had left San Antonio and who had, she had no doubt, resources and contacts that she did not. She thought about the children downstairs, one of whom had apparently dreamed her into existence before she arrived. "I will take the room," she said, "for 1 month with the option to extend." "That is agreeable," Marcus said. She pulled $3 from the small purse she kept inside her dress pocket and held it out to him. He crossed the room to take it, and when his fingers closed around the coins they brushed against her palm, brief and accidental, and she saw him register it the same way she registered it, a small involuntary awareness, a noting of temperature. He pocketed the money and stepped back. "Supper is at 6, he said. "Clara sets the table and does not like it when people are late, so I would advise being on time." "I am always on time," Ruth said. He almost smiled too. He caught it before it fully arrived. "Then you and Clara will get along fine," he said, and went back downstairs. The first week was careful and structured and alive, with the small tensions of two people orbiting each other with excessive precision. Ruth had meals with the family because the notice had said meals included, and there was no separate arrangement. And so she sat at the long kitchen table across from Elia's and next to Clara, and at the other end of the table from Marcus, and she passed the bread and the butter and the beans and the salt, and she answered Elia's questions about Missouri, and about books, and about whether she believed in ghosts with the same measured, careful honesty she had used in classrooms for 4 years. Clara, she quickly discovered, was not primarily interested in conversation. Clara was interested in observation. She watched Ruth with a deep and systematic attention that was not hostile but was absolute, cataloging her, filing her, reaching some private verdict that she was not yet ready to share. Elias was her father's son in structure, broad-shouldered and watchful, but he had some quality of openness about him that was purely his own, a directness that could be disarming because it came without agenda. "Why did you leave where you were before?" he asked on the third evening, over a supper of salt pork and sweet potatoes that Marcus had cooked with a quiet efficiency that suggested the kitchen was genuinely his domain. "Elias," Marcus said, a single word of warning, gentle but present. "It is all right," Ruth said. She considered the question the way she considered all direct questions from people she was not yet ready to trust with the full truth. She found the portion of truth that was safe to give. "I needed a change," she said. "Sometimes a person outgrows where they are. It happens. It is not always dramatic." "Was it dramatic for you?" Elias asked. She looked at him. He looked back at her without guile, just genuine inquiry, and she thought, "This child is going to be a problem for my secrets." "A little," she said. "Papa's change was dramatic," Elias said. "He used to be a U.S. Marshal." This information rearranged several things in Ruth's mind very quickly. She looked down the table at Marcus, who was looking at his son with an expression that combined exasperation and resignation in equal measure. "I was," Marcus said, "for 8 years. I left the service when Anne got sick. I wanted to be home." "And then she died anyway," Elias said, not with cruelty but with the terrible factual honesty of children who have processed grief in ways that bypass conventional delicacy. "And then she died anyway," Marcus agreed quietly, "which taught me that the timing of things is often outside our control, but that the choices are still worth making." Ruth looked at her plate. Former U.S. Marshal. She was living in the house of a former U.S. Marshal, and she was carrying forged federal documents in the lining of her traveling bag, and she was hiding from a man who had committed federal fraud across 2 states. The universe, she decided, had a very specific and very exhausting sense of humor. She began working at the schoolhouse the following Monday. Miss Patterson, whose full name was Dorothy Patterson and who was 52, and had the compact, decisive manner of a woman who has held a room of unruly children to order for 30 years, interviewed her for exactly 12 minutes before offering her the position of teaching assistant at $15 a month. "You're qualified," Dorothy said, looking at Ruth's letter of reference from San Antonio, which was genuine and which Ruth had thought to take with her when she fled, "and you're here. Those are the two most important factors. The children in this town are sharp. They need someone who will not condescend to them." "I have never condescended to a child in my professional life," Ruth said. "It seems to me that children are simply people who have had less time to collect damage." Dorothy looked at her over her reading glasses with something that was the beginning of respect. "Start Monday," she said. The schoolhouse was a single room, 23 students between the ages of 6 and 14, one wood stove, 3 rows of benches, and a blackboard that had seen better decades. Ruth threw herself into it with the focused energy of a woman who needs something legitimate to pour herself into so that she does not spend all her time thinking about the thing she is afraid of. She was good at this work. She had always been good at it. There was something about the classroom that operated on its own internal logic, separate from the world of adult deception and hidden motives. A child struggling with long division was simply struggling with long division. The problem was clear, the process was learnable, the solution was honest. Ruth loved that about it. She was walking home from the schoolhouse on her 9th day in redemption. In the early evening, with the autumn sky laid out above her in bands of amber and deep rose, when she saw the rider at the edge of town. He was a long way off, standing at the top of the rise where the main road came in from the south, and he was sitting very still on a pale horse in a way that triggered something old and animal in Ruth's nervous system. She kept walking. She did not change her pace or her direction, but she noted the horse and the stillness and the direction of the rider's attention, which was toward her. When she arrived home, she went to her room before supper and stood at the east window for a long time, looking at the cottonwood trees and thinking very hard. She could not be certain. It might have been anyone. Redemption was a busy town with cattle roads running through it and strangers arriving daily. But she had been careful, and the specific quality of that stillness on the ridge suggested someone who was watching rather than simply arriving. At supper she was quieter than usual. Clara noticed. Clara noticed everything. "You are worried about something," Clara said, passing the cornbread with both hands the way her father had taught her. "I am thinking about tomorrow's lessons," Ruth said. "That is not what worried looks like," Clara said. "Worried is different. Papa does worried when he reads the bank letters." "Clara," Marcus said, but gently. "She is right," Ruth said, and caught herself because she had not intended to confirm it, but Clara's directness had pulled it out of her before her guard was fully engaged. "I'm a little worried. It is nothing serious." Marcus looked at her from his end of the table. She looked back at him. Something passed between them, not a conversation, but the outline of one, a mutual recognition that this subject existed and that it was not currently being discussed. After supper, while the children cleared the table and argued companionably about whose turn it was to wash the plates, Marcus came to stand beside her near the kitchen stove with 2 cups of coffee, and he held one out to her. "I will not push," he said quietly, "but I was a marshal for 8 years. I know what a person who is watching for trouble looks like." She took the coffee. She wrapped both hands around it. Outside the kitchen window the October dark had come down fully, and the wind was making the cottonwood leaves move against each other with a dry, papery sound. "There is something in my past," she said. "I am not certain it has followed me here. I am not certain it hasn't." "Is it the kind of thing that puts the children at risk?" he asked. No accusation, just a direct question from a man who had the right to ask it. She turned and looked at him. "No," she said. "The person involved does not operate with direct violence. He operates through legal mechanisms and through influence. He is dangerous, but not in the way you are probably thinking. And you have something he wants." She blinked. He saw too much. She had known that from the first evening, but she was still not accustomed to it. "Possibly," she said. "Do you need help?" The question was so simple, so stripped of conditions and negotiations, that she felt something give way in her chest that she had not known was braced. She pressed her lips together and looked at the dark window. "Not yet," she said, "but I may." "Then you know where to find me," he said, and took his coffee to the kitchen table and called to Elias to stop hiding behind the dispute about dishes and come play a round of checkers. Ruth stood at the stove for a moment longer with her coffee and her secrets, and the particular hollow ache of a woman who is beginning, against her better judgment, to trust someone. The writer came back 2 days later. Ruth saw him from the schoolhouse window, standing again at the edge of town, this time closer. She was in the middle of a reading lesson and she continued it without interruption, but after school, she went directly to the general store rather than home, because she needed an errand that looked ordinary, and because she wanted to circle the long way around to get a better look at the horse. She did not need to get close. The pale horse, standing outside the saloon, was wearing a San Antonio brand on its left flank, the particular burn mark of the Whitmore family's Goliad stables that she had seen often enough in the past year to recognize it even at distance. She stood very still for a moment in the gathering dusk outside the general store, with a small packet of writing paper in her hands and the cold facts arranging themselves with horrible clarity. Gerald Whitmore had sent someone to redemption. The only question was whether the man had found her yet, and the answer to that question was almost certainly yes, because she was not difficult to identify. Red-haired schoolteachers' assistants were not common in a town of 300 people. She went home. She went directly to her room. She took the folder from the lining of her traveling bag and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at it for a long time. The documents were detailed and specific: names, dates, amounts, the names of the federal surveyors who had died. They were the kind of evidence that would end Gerald Whitmore's career and potentially his freedom. They were also the kind of evidence that made her valuable alive and dangerous dead, which was a calculation she had been careful not to look at too directly since San Antonio, because it was exactly as frightening as it sounded. She heard Marcus's boots on the stairs. He knocked on her door. She slipped the folder under her mattress before she answered. He was standing in the hallway with his coat on and his hat in his hand, and his expression was the specific expression of a man who has received information and is processing it with great restraint. "There is a man in town asking questions about a red-haired woman from San Antonio," he said. "He spoke to Bill Granger at the saloon. Bill mentioned it to me because Bill is the kind of man who believes in community information." Ruth leaned against the door frame and looked at the floor. "What kind of questions?" she asked. Whether she had arrived recently, whether she was living in town. He paused. Whether she was living alone. She looked up. "What did Bill tell him?" "Bill told him he hadn't seen any such woman," Marcus said, "which is not untrue since Bill almost never comes to this end of town and would not know you by sight. But someone else will tell him," she said. "Someone else probably already has," Marcus said. He was very still in the hallway, this former marshal with the river water eyes, and she could see him conducting some internal assessment, not of her, but of the situation, the way a man who spent 8 years with a badge evaluates threat levels. "I told you there was something," she said. "You told me it was legal mechanisms," he said. "Legal mechanisms don't generally send riders to ask whether a woman is living alone." She was quiet for a moment. Then she made a decision that she had been moving toward for days without fully admitting it, because the alternative, which was to run again, felt like something she could no longer do. She had been running for 6 weeks. She was tired of the motion of it, the constant recalculation, the weight of carrying danger in a bag while pretending to be ordinary. "Come in," she said, and stepped back from the door. She told him. Not everything at once, but in the order that made logical sense, starting with Gerald Whitmore and the letter she had found and the nature of the scheme. moving to the documents she had taken and what they contained, and arriving at the present with the pale horse in front of the saloon, and the feeling that the 6 weeks of running had reached their end point in this room. Marcus sat in the chair by the writing desk and listened without interrupting. His hat rested on his knee. His face held the focused patience of a man who has trained himself to receive information before he responds to it. When she finished, she pulled the folder out from under the mattress and held it out to him. He took it. He read through it twice slowly with the thoroughness of a man who understands legal documents. 2 federal surveyors, he said. Listed as accidents, Ruth said. They were not. No, he agreed. He turned another page. He forged your signature here. He intended to. She pointed to the line. That is not my signature. I have never signed anything connected to this scheme because I did not know about it. The land grant applications he attached these to, Marcus said. These were filed with the Federal Land Office in Austin in August. I know. I did not know about any of it until the night I found the letter. Marcus set the folder on the writing desk and looked at her with an expression that was several things at once, none of them simple. You have been carrying federal evidence against a man who has already had 2 people killed, he said, for 6 weeks, alone. I am aware of how that sounds, she said. It sounds like extraordinary courage or extraordinary stubbornness, he said, possibly both. My mother always said I combined the worst qualities of each, she said. And she did not intend it to be funny, but it landed that way lightly, and he almost smiled. That caught smile she was beginning to recognize as his particular brand of restraint. These documents need to go to the federal marshal's office, he said. The one in Abilene, not Austin, because he has contacts in Austin and we cannot know who is compromised. I still know people in the service. I can send a telegram. And in the meantime, Ruth said, the man he sent is here. In the meantime, Marcus said, standing up from the chair with a decision already made in the set of his shoulders, you are not alone. She looked at him. He met her gaze, and there was something in it that was both the professional assessment of a man who has handled dangerous situations and something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with documents or federal fraud or pale horses in front of saloons. Something that was entirely about her and entirely about him and the space between them in this small room with the cold wind at the window. Thank you, she said, and meant it in ways she was not prepared to articulate. He took the folder with him. He sent the telegram to Abilene the next morning before Ruth left for the schoolhouse, and the response came back within the day. A short message from a federal marshal named Hollis Crane, who had been Marcus's partner for 3 years, and who stated that he was aware of the Whitmore investigation, that it had been opened in Austin 2 months prior following the death of the second surveyor, and that he would be in redemption within 4 days. The man with the pale horse left town the following morning. Ruth saw him go from the schoolhouse window, that same stillness on the ridge in reverse, watching the town recede behind him. She did not know whether he had found what he came for or whether he had been sent back for instructions, but his absence bought them 4 days, and 4 days was enough. What she had not anticipated was what those 4 days would contain beyond the waiting. There was something about the knowledge of shared danger that stripped the social architecture away, the careful distance and the measured politeness and the performance of ordinary border-end landlord, and left something more essential underneath. She and Marcus existed in the house during those 4 days in a state of heightened mutual awareness that was both about the threat and entirely separate from it. She helped him mend the fence along the north edge of the property on a Saturday afternoon while the children were at school and the sky was high and pale and cold, and they worked side by side in the kind of focused, companionable silence that is its own form of communication, passing the wire stretcher back and forth, their hands occasionally meeting, their breath misting in the air between them. He was not a man who spoke for the sake of speaking. She was not a woman who made noise to fill quiet. They were, she realized with some shock, extraordinarily compatible in the specific ways that matter most during long hours of work. You like being a marshal, she said at one point, not a question. I was good at it, he said, which was a different answer. He pulled the wire taut and held it while she twisted the end. Being good at something and liking it are two separate things. I was good at reading people and good at managing dangerous situations, and I did not like waking up before dawn to ride toward trouble. I did it because it needed doing and because I believed in what it stood for. And now, he looked up at her. The winter light made everything very clear, no shadows, no softening. Now I believe in this fence and that house and those two children, he said. That is enough to stand for. She looked at him for a moment too long and then looked away at the cottonwood line and the gray sky beyond it. You are a good father, she said. It was not what she meant to say, which was something considerably larger and more frightening, but it was true and it was safe. I am trying to be, he said. Anne was better at the daily tenderness of it. I am better at the structure. Between us we had something balanced. He paused. Without her the balance is different. Not wrong, just different. Clara has her eye on the structure, Ruth observed. He laughed. It was a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and it changed his face completely, made him younger and less careful, and she felt it in her chest like the first note of a song she had not known she had been waiting to hear. She does, he said. She has had her eye on everything since she was about 3 years old. Anne used to say that Clara came into the world already suspicious that it was being managed incorrectly and intending to correct that. She is wonderful, Ruth said. She meant it completely. He looked at her. He had that expression again, the one she was learning to read, the one where several things were happening at once, and the most important one was barely visible. She likes you, he said. She does not like many people. She tolerates most of them. Elias brought home a friend last spring who she tolerated for 2 weeks and then sat down and formally explained his shortcomings to him. The friend cried. Ruth covered her mouth with her hand. Was she right about the shortcomings? Completely and devastatingly accurate, Marcus said. She laughed then too. And the fence stretched between them in the cold Saturday air, and the cottonwoods moved at the edge of the property. And for a few minutes the documents and the pale horse and the man in San Antonio with blood on his ledger books receded to the necessary background where they belonged. And what was present and immediate was this: 2 people laughing together in the autumn cold. That evening, after supper, Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway where Ruth was helping wash the dishes and announced without preamble, I think you should stay. Marcus looked up from the table where he was reviewing his accounts. Elias looked up from his book. Ruth held a wet plate and looked at Clara. I am staying, Ruth said carefully, until the end of the month, and then we shall see about extending. I mean after that, Clara said. I mean permanently. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. The lamp threw its warm circle on the table and the dishes and the faces of the people in the room. That is not something you can decide, sweetheart, Marcus said. His voice was steady, but Ruth, who was learning his voice the way you learn the sounds of a house you live in, could hear the thing underneath the steadiness. I know I cannot decide, Clara said with dignity. I am expressing my preference. I hear your preference, Marcus said. Ruth. Clara said, turning to her directly with the absolute confidence of a child who has never learned to be strategic about wanting things. Ruth set the plate down carefully. She looked at the 7-year-old girl who had opened a door to her like she was expected, and had been watching her ever since with those ancient, steady eyes. She looked at Elias, who had put his book down entirely, and was watching the scene with the focused attention of a child who knows something important is happening. She looked at Marcus, who was looking back at her with an expression that was not quite neutral anymore, that was not trying as hard as usual to be composed, that was simply open and honest and terrifying. I will think about it, Ruth said, which was not no. Everyone in the room understood that it was not no. Marshal Holly's crane arrived on the 4th day, as promised, on a bay horse, and in the company of a younger deputy whose name was Price. He was a tall, spare man of about 50 with a gray beard and a manner that combined absolute authority with a quality of human decency that Ruth recognized immediately as genuine. He sat at Marcus's kitchen table and read through the documents for a long time while everyone else waited. Marcus sat across from him. Ruth sat at the end of the table. The children were at school. "These are what we needed," Crane said finally. He looked at Ruth. "You had these for 6 weeks and you didn't turn them in." "I did not know who to trust," she said. "That was the right judgment," he said without apparent offense. "The Austin office has a problem, 2 agents compromised. We knew about the Whitmore scheme, but we couldn't break it because we didn't have this level of documentation." He tapped the folder. "With this, we have everything." "What happens now?" Ruth asked. "We send this to the federal court in Fort Worth with my affidavit about how it was obtained. We issue the warrant." He looked at her steadily. "You will need to give a statement. You will likely need to testify." She had known this was coming. She had known it since the night she took the documents from the desk. She had run from the knowledge of it for 6 weeks along with everything else. "I know," she said. "It will not be comfortable," Crane said. "Whitmore has resources. He will fight it." "He was going to use my name and my reputation to commit fraud," Ruth said. "He was going to make me a criminal without my knowledge. I would like to see him fight that in a federal courtroom." Crane looked at her for a moment with something that might have been admiration. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He turned to Marcus. "You are certain about hosting the investigation here. He may send more men." "I am certain," Marcus said. "Your former badge still carries weight," Crane said. "Informally, but it carries weight." "I know," Marcus said. "I am not uninformed about what I am taking on." "I know you are not," Crane said, and there was something between them, the shorthand of men who had worked together under pressure, a mutual reading that required no elaboration. After Crane and Price took the documents and left to establish themselves at the hotel, Marcus and Ruth stood in the kitchen in the particular quiet that follows the resolution of something you have been holding your breath against. "It will be all right now," Marcus said. It was not platitude. It was assessment. "I know," she said. She felt the 6 weeks of held tension beginning slowly to release, like a fist opening muscle by muscle, and the sensation was so profound that it made her dizzy. She put one hand on the edge of the kitchen table to steady herself. He was beside her before she registered that he had moved, his hand on her elbow, steadying, present. "Ruth," he said. She looked up at him. She was close enough that she could see the particular geography of his face in full detail, the tiredness around his eyes that was chronic and structural, the line at the corner of his mouth that deepened when he was controlling something, the way his jaw held itself. "I am all right," she said. "I know you are," he said. He did not remove his hand from her elbow. "That is not what I was about to say," she waited. "I was going to say that I am glad you came to this door," he said. His voice was low and very serious, and it did not have any of the usual careful neutrality in it. It was just the truth, bare and direct. "Whatever the reason you came, whatever was following you, I am glad you came here." She could feel the warmth of his hand through the fabric of her sleeve. She was aware of the distance between them, or rather the lack of it, and the fact that neither of them was doing anything to create more of it. "I did not expect this," she said. "Any of this. I came because there was a notice. I came because I needed a roof and a hiding place. I did not come expecting." She stopped. "I know," he said. "Neither did I, but I stopped being surprised by what life produces when I was not expecting it when Elias described a woman with red hair to me 3 weeks before you arrived." "You believe your son's dream was real," she said. "I believe the woman standing in my kitchen is real," he said. "That is enough for me." She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was warm and the afternoon was moving toward evening and the lamp would need lighting soon, and the children would be coming home from school and there were 100 ordinary things waiting to be done. And in the middle of all of it she said, "I think I am staying." He smiled then. The full smile, not the caught one, not the suppressed one, the real one that she had only seen once before in the cold with the fence between them and the gray sky above. It rearranged his face into something open and warm, and she thought, there it is. There is what he actually looks like when nothing is held back. He released her elbow. He stepped back not far, not with any suggestion of retreat, just to the proper distance for a kitchen in an autumn afternoon. "Good," he said, and then, "Supper is going to be late tonight. I got distracted from the stew." She picked up the wooden spoon from the counter. "I know how to make a stew," she said. "I never doubted it," he said. She turned to the stove. He set about lighting the lamp, and the house moved into evening around them, ordinary and particular and full. The legal proceedings against Gerald Whitmore took 3 months. Ruth gave her statement to Marshal Crane in November, a careful and precise account that took 4 hours and left her tired in the way that comes from being extremely accurate under pressure. She testified at the preliminary hearing in Fort Worth in January, traveling there and back in the company of Marcus and Crane and the Deputy Price, and she sat in a hard wooden chair in a federal courtroom and told the truth about a man who had intended to use her as an instrument, and watched him sit 20 feet away in a good suit with his lawyer and his composed expression, and she did not flinch once. Gerald Whitmore's lawyer was skilled. He argued the documents were taken illegally. He argued Ruth's character. He argued coincidence and misinterpretation. He was arguing against the specific and detailed truth, which is a fight that skilled lawyers often lose when the documentation is thorough enough. The documents were thorough enough. By February, Gerald Whitmore had been indicted on federal fraud charges, conspiracy to commit fraud, falsification of federal records, and was under investigation by a separate committee for the deaths of the 2 surveyors. He would not walk free for a very long time. The 2 compromised agents in the Austin office were removed from service. The forged land grants were voided. Ruth's forged signature was formally and officially disavowed in the federal record. She came back to redemption in late February with the clean, particular feeling of a woman who has set down something very heavy that she had been carrying for a long time. The sky above the Cottonwood Lane was winter white, and the house at the end of it had lamplight in every window because Marcus had known approximately when the stage was due and had lit them all. The children were on the porch despite the cold. Elias in his coat and Clara in hers, standing as they had stood on the day she arrived, side by side in the doorframe, waiting. She climbed down from the buggy she had hired at the stage depot, her traveling bag in her hand, and she stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at them. "You are back," Clara said. It was not a question. It was something else, some specifically 7-year-old version of relief and exhale. "I am back," Ruth said. Elias came down the steps and took her bag from her hand with the practiced competence of a boy who has been taught to be helpful, and the action was so natural and so unthinking that she felt something catch in her throat. Marcus appeared in the doorway behind the children, one hand on the door frame, the lamplight at his back. He looked at her for a moment with that open, unheld expression she had been keeping with her through 3 months of difficulty like a talisman. "Supper is ready," he said. "Clara helped make the biscuits. They are excellent." "I know how to make biscuits," Clara said with dignity. "I am very hungry," Ruth said, and went up the steps and through the door and back into the warmth. The courtship, if one could call it that, because neither Ruth Callahan nor Marcus Atkins were people who approached significant things at a run, had been happening in the spaces between everything else for the whole of that first 3 months. It had been in the fence mending and the supper table and the cups of coffee in the kitchen after the children went to bed. It had been in the conversations about books and about law and about the nature of justice and about what the frontier did to people, some of them good things and some of them not. It had been in the Sunday afternoon in December when Elias fell off the barn roof trying to retrieve a kite and sprained his wrist, and Marcus and Ruth had dealt with it side by side, her holding Elias' arm steady and Marcus wrapping it with the expertise of a man who had field-dressed worse in his years as a marshal. And afterward they had sat at the kitchen table together while Elias slept, not quite touching, not quite talking, existing in the particular shared relief of 2 people who care about the same child. It had been in the evening in January before Ruth left for Fort Worth when Clara came to Ruth's room and sat on the edge of the bed and did not say anything for several minutes and then said, "Will you come back?" And Ruth had said, "Yes, Clara, I will come back," and Clara had said, "Papa says not to make promises we do not know if we can keep," and Ruth had said, "Your father is right about most things, but I am promising you this one specifically because I am certain of it," and Clara had looked at her with those ancient steady eyes and said, "All right," and gone back to bed. It had been in the letter Marcus had written to her in Fort Worth, a careful letter, not a love letter in the conventional sense, but a letter that told her the fence had held through the first hard freeze, and that Elias had received a commendation at school, and that Clara had informed the family at supper that Ruth would return safely because she had decided she would, and that Marcus had thought about whether to write to her at all, and had decided the honest answer to that question was yes. She had read that letter 4 times. She had written back. Her own letter was also careful and also not a love letter in the conventional sense, and also somehow unmistakably one. In March, when the weather began to turn, when the first pale suggestion of spring appeared in the cottonwoods along the dry creek bed, Marcus came to find her one evening on the porch where she had taken to sitting after supper with her coffee and the last of the day's light. He sat down in the other chair, which had been added to the porch sometime in December, and whose arrival had not been remarked upon by either of them, though they both understood its meaning. "I want to say something to you," he said. She set down her coffee. She looked at him. He was looking at the cottonwood line, at the new green that was beginning in the branches. He had that look of a man about to say a true thing that costs something, that requires the setting aside of the careful architecture that keeps private things private. "When Anne died," he said, "I thought I was done. Not done in a desperate way, not done in the way that people worry about. Just done in the way that certain things are done when the center of them is gone. I thought the part of me that could feel what I felt with her was finished. I thought it was a specific thing that had existed because she had existed and would not exist again because she did not anymore." He paused. "I was wrong about that." Ruth said nothing. She was very still. "I do not say this to diminish Anne," he said. "What she was to me was real and complete, and I will carry it for the rest of my life. But I have learned something in the last 5 months, which is that love is not a fixed quantity, that it does not run out, that it is not a betrayal of one love to feel another." He turned to look at her. "I am feeling another." She looked at him. The evening light was going gold in the way that March evenings do, warmer than the months before, full of some quality of return. "Marcus," she said, "I know that your situation was complicated when you arrived," he said. "I know that there was a man who used the idea of you without your permission, and that leaves a specific kind of mark. I'm not asking you to decide anything. I am telling you what is true for me so that you have the information and can do what you like with it." She looked at him for a long, full moment. She thought about San Antonio and about Gerald Whitmore and about the 6 weeks of running and about what it had done to her sense of what she could trust and what she could allow herself to feel. She thought about what it was to be used as an instrument by a man who had presented himself as safe. She thought about the very first evening in this house when she had stood in a room with a fire already laid and thought, "Is this a trap?" And then she thought about all the other things, the fence, the coffee, the letter from Fort Worth, the Sunday afternoon with Elia's wrist, Clara in her room saying, "Will you come back," with that face that was both a child and something much older. She thought about what it felt like to sit on this porch in the evenings with the other chair beside her. "I am feeling it too," she said. "I have been feeling it for some time." He reached over and took her hand. His hand was large and warm and held hers with a specific quality of care, firm enough to be certain, gentle enough to leave her free. She looked down at their joined hands on the arm of the chair. She thought, there it is, the simple, undeniable fact of it. "I am not a man who does things casually," he said. "I want you to know that." "I know that," she said. "I have known that since approximately the 3rd day." He looked at her. "You were counting days." "I was orienting myself," she said with dignity. "It required landmarks." He smiled, the real one, and she leaned across and kissed him, which surprised them both, because she had not planned it and he had not expected it, and it was brief and warm and very honest, and when she pulled back he was looking at her with the expression of a man who has just received information that fundamentally reorders several things. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. Clara appeared in the doorway behind them. Her timing was, as always, uncanny. "Are you going to get married?" she asked. Marcus and Ruth looked at each other. Marcus looked at his daughter. Clara looked back at him with the steady patience of a child prepared to wait as long as necessary for the correct answer. "We are working in that direction," Marcus said. "Good," Clara said. "I will set 3 plates from now on," and she went back inside. Elia's head appeared briefly at the window beside the door. He looked out at the two of them on the porch with his hands on the sill. He nodded once, gravely, in the manner of a 9-year-old who has received confirmation of something he has known since a dream in September. Then he disappeared. Ruth turned back to the evening and the cottonwood trees and the first proper warmth of the coming year. Marcus's hand was still around hers. "Your children," she said. "Our children," he said, quietly, without pressure. A statement offered to the air to see how it settled. She felt it settle. She did not say anything for a while. Then she said, "Yes." They were married in May, on a Saturday when the weather was warm and the whole town of Redemption seemed to develop an opinion about the occasion. Dorothy Patterson from the schoolhouse stood up with Ruth. Marshal Crane rode down from Abilene specifically for the ceremony and shook Marcus's hand with the particular warmth of a man who knows what another man has lost and is glad to see something restored. Reverend Fellows at the Presbyterian Church on Oak Street performed the ceremony with the brisk practical warmth of a man who marries people on the frontier and has developed a sense of what really matters. Clara wore a white dress with a blue sash that she had selected herself and managed with complete dignity until the moment Ruth came down the aisle, at which point she cried suddenly and without warning, and then composed herself and denied having done so for the remainder of the day. Elias did not cry. He stood beside his father at the front of the church, with his hands clasped behind his back in the exact pose Ruth had first seen him in at the door of the house, and he watched her walk down the aisle with an expression of profound satisfaction, as though the natural order of things was being properly restored. Marcus turned as she came to stand beside him and looked at her with that full, open expression that she now knew meant nothing was held back, nothing was withheld, that what you were seeing was the whole of what was there, and she thought, this is what it is supposed to feel like. Not the performance of love, not the instrument of love used without knowledge, the real thing. The whole thing. She took his hand at the altar and felt the warmth of it as she always did. The Reverend said the words. They gave their answers. Marcus put a ring on her finger that had been his grandmother's, a small gold band with a simple engraving on the inside that she would not read until that evening. And when she finally did, sitting at the mirror in their room, she found 2 words engraved in the metal, "Stay here." She traced them with her finger. She thought about a porch in October with a notice in her hand, and a door opening before she knocked, and 2 children standing in the frame like they had been waiting. She thought about all the miles between San Antonio and this room, all the fear and the running and the weight of carrying someone else's crime in the lining of a bag. She put the ring back on her hand and went downstairs where Marcus was checking on the children, and the house was warm and full, and she stayed. The first year of their marriage was a season of small adjustments and deep contentments, the ordinary miracle of 2 people learning to share a life. Ruth continued her work at the schoolhouse, which Dorothy Patterson had shifted entirely to her management by autumn, as Dorothy's arthritis made the daily work harder. Ruth took the school with the same focused energy she brought to everything, and under her management the enrollment grew from 23 to 31 students, and the school board approved a second wood stove. Marcus expanded the farm's winter operation and took on 2 hired hands, brothers named Pete and Daniel Orr, whose family had come up from the South and who were steady and reliable workers. And for the first time since Ann's death, the farm was running in the black rather than the red. Elias grew 3 inches in 8 months, and developed a passion for mathematics that Ruth fed with a new textbook she ordered specially from a publisher in Chicago. Clara turned 8 and then 9 and continued her systematic management of the household with the particular competence of a child who has decided that competence is her natural territory and will not be argued out of it. What changed between Marcus and Ruth in that first year was nothing dramatic. It was the accumulation of ordinary days lived in full honesty with another person, which is a more profound transformation than any dramatic event. She learned his silences, and he learned hers. She learned that he was afraid of exactly one thing, not violence, not loss, not the hard practical challenges of the frontier, but of being insufficient, of not being enough for the people he loved, a fear that lived in him so quietly and so deeply that it took her 6 months to identify it. And when she did, she turned to him in the morning light of their room and said, "You are enough, more than enough. I need you to know that." And he looked at her for a long moment and then pulled her close and said nothing, because sometimes the only answer to a thing is to let it be held. She learned that he carried Anne's absence the way you carry a healed fracture, not a wound, but a place where the structure has been rebuilt and remains different afterward. She did not try to fill that place or replace it. She did not need to. She had her own place, her own presence, and there was room in his heart, as she had told Clara there would be, for all of it. He learned that she organized her anxiety into action, that when she was afraid, she cleaned or planned or wrote things in lists, that the safest way to know she was worried was to find her rearranging the pantry at midnight. He learned to come downstairs on those nights and sit at the kitchen table and be present without requiring her to explain, and she learned to let him be present without explaining, and this was, in its way, the most intimate thing between them. In the late spring of the second year, Ruth began to suspect that the household would be growing, and she confirmed her suspicion with the doctor in town on a Tuesday in April, and came home to find Marcus on the porch with his coffee and the evening settling around him, and she sat down in her chair and said, "You are going to need to add a room." He looked at her. His face moved through several expressions in rapid sequence and arrived at something so open and unguarded that she felt it in her chest like sunlight. "When," he said, "November, the doctor says." She paused. "A boy, he thinks, though he admits he has been wrong before." Marcus set down his coffee and crossed the porch in 2 steps and crouched beside her chair and took her face in both hands and kissed her with a quality of feeling that was complete and unhesitating, and she thought, yes, this, exactly this. Clara, appearing in the doorway with the timing that Ruth had come to understand was simply her particular gift, observed them and said, "Are we getting a baby?" "We are," Marcus said, turning to look at her over his shoulder. Clara considered this. "I will need to instruct it," she said. "You can start once it arrives," Marcus told her. "I can start planning now," Clara said, and went back inside with purpose. Elias, who had heard from the yard where he was splitting kindling, put down the axe and walked to the base of the porch steps and looked up at his father with eyes that held both his age and something older. "Mama would be glad," he said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Ruth watched him hold the statement the way you hold something precious and fragile. "Yes," he said, "she would be glad." Elias nodded. He picked up the axe and went back to the kindling. The summer was long and warm, and Ruth managed her expanding self with the same practical efficiency she managed everything. Though she admitted to Marcus on several occasions that the heat of a Texas summer in the 3rd trimester was an experience she had not sufficiently factored into the November calculation. And Marcus responded to this by arranging the sitting room so that she had the coolest chair near the best window, and by bringing her cold water in the evenings with a consistency that she found both touching and faintly amusing. The baby arrived in October, not November, a month early and vigorous about it. A boy with Marcus's coloring and his father's particular expression of focused assessment already present in his first week, as though he had arrived already considering the implications of things. They named him Thomas, after Marcus's father. And Thomas Atkins came into the world on an October morning when the cottonwoods were turning gold, and the sky was that particular high autumn blue that Ruth associated with beginnings. Clara, who had spent the month before the birth in intense preparation that involved the construction of a detailed schedule of infant management, took one look at her brother and said, "He looks like Papa did in the picture from before." "He does," Marcus agreed. "I will teach him everything," Clara said. "Give him a week first," Ruth said. 2 days, Clara negotiated. Thomas thrived. He was loud and demanding and had specific opinions about the world from about 6 weeks onward. And Elias, who was now 12 and had the patient temperament of someone who has decided that equanimity is a more useful quality than drama, took his position as elder brother with quiet seriousness, and could often be found with Thomas on his lap, talking to him about mathematics or about the progress of the farm in the tone of a person who believes that infants benefit from being taken seriously. The house on Cottonwood Lane added its room in the spring following Thomas's birth, a proper addition off the north side that Marcus and Pete and Daniel Orr built over 2 weekends, and the boarding house room on the second floor, which had sat empty since Ruth had moved into the main bedroom, was taken by a young woman named Vera Stanton, who had come to Redemption to work at the milliner's, and who was quiet and sensible, and who Dorothy Patterson had sent to the Atkins house, specifically because she knew Ruth would make her feel welcome. Life in Redemption moved on in the way that life in small frontier towns moves, marked by seasons and harvests and the arrivals and departures of people, by the slow, reliable changes of a community planting itself into the earth and growing roots. The schoolhouse expanded again. The town got its first proper bank. A doctor came and stayed, which was rare and celebrated. The cattle road shifted slightly northward but still brought trade, and Marcus's farm with its winter wheat and its new orchard of young apple trees began to produce in ways that removed the financial anxiety that had lived in this house when Ruth first arrived. The evening that she would remember most often from those early years was an ordinary one in the summer of 1885, 3 years after her arrival at that door. She was sitting on the porch in the long summer light with Thomas in her lap, 8 months old and working very hard on the project of sitting upright unassisted, and Marcus was beside her with his coffee, and Elias was at the far end of the yard with a geometry problem that he had spread out on the grass, and Clara was in the swing that Marcus had hung from the cottonwood tree at the yard's edge, pushing herself slowly back and forth with one foot. The evening was golden and the air smelled of warm grass and the apple blossoms from the young orchard, and somewhere in the distance a mockingbird was conducting a complex performance of stolen songs. Ruth looked at Marcus. He was watching Thomas's efforts with the particular expression she had come to know as his best one, the one that was entirely present, entirely glad. "Marcus," she said. He looked at her. "I want you to know something," she said. "I came here with a bag full of someone else's crimes and 6 weeks of fear behind me, and a plan that extended exactly as far as 1 month's rent. I had no expectation of any of this." She gestured, a gesture that encompassed the yard and the children and the house and him and the evening light on all of it. "None of this was in the plan." "No," he agreed. "I want you to know," she said, "that it is better than anything I would have planned." He looked at her for a moment. Thomas chose this moment to achieve his objective of sitting upright without support, and both of them redirected their attention to celebrate this accomplishment, which Thomas received with the expression of a person who expected nothing less. And then Marcus reached over and took her hand, and held it as the evening moved into dusk around them, and the mockingbird found a new song, and Clara swung in the golden air, and Elias solved his geometry problem, and declared victory into the grass. This was the life that had been in the door when she knocked on it, though she could not have known that. This was what the children had been waiting to let in. In the summer of 1886, Clara turned 11 and decided that she wanted to learn to ride properly, not the basics she had known since she was small, but really ride, with confidence and speed across open ground. Ruth taught her. Ruth had learned on a Missouri farm and had not ridden seriously in years, but she found the knowledge still in her hands and her body, and they rode together in the early mornings before school, when the air was cool and the light was new, and the land opened up around them with a quality of possibility that Ruth associated with all the best things. Clara was a natural rider, which surprised no one who knew her. She took to it with the systematic competence she brought to everything, and by the end of summer she could outride most of the boys her age in redemption, a fact she mentioned at the dinner table with complete absence of boastfulness, simply as information. "It is not a competition," Marcus said. "Everything is a competition," Clara said. "The question is whether you are winning." "That is a concerning philosophy," Marcus said. "It is a practical one," Clara said. Ruth met Marcus's eyes across the table, and they conducted their usual silent conversation, the married people language that operates without words, and the conclusion they reached was, "She is entirely herself, and that is a wonderful thing." Elias at 14 was reading law books that he borrowed from the small library that the town had established above the post office, and Marcus and Ruth had begun to have the quiet conversation, not yet in front of Elias, about whether there might be a way to send him east to study law properly, whether the farm and the school could support the cost of it. It was not yet possible, but it was coming into focus as a thing that might one day be possible, and that focus was its own form of hope. Thomas, at 2, was ferociously verbal and physically ambitious, and had the habit of following Elias everywhere with the specific dedication of a younger sibling who has identified his primary hero. Elias bore this with grace and even occasional delight. The year turned toward 1887, and Ruth discovered in the spring that Thomas would not remain the youngest Atkins for much longer. She told Marcus in the kitchen on a Tuesday evening, straightforwardly, as she told him everything. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at her and said, "I keep thinking that the capacity for this feeling must be finite. I keep being wrong about that." She smiled at him. "The doctor says summer," she said. "Clara will need at least 2 days of preparation," he said. "I already told Clara," Ruth said. He looked at her, and she said that she hoped for a girl this time because she had specific plans for a sister. "She has specific plans for everything." "She does," Ruth said. "I find that comforting." The baby born that July was a girl, and she arrived in the world in the early morning with the mockingbirds going outside the window and the summer heat beginning to build, and she was small and red-faced and entirely determined, and Marcus held her with the careful, overwhelming tenderness of a man who has held infants before and has not become accustomed to the weight of them, who finds it new each time, and Ruth watched his face and thought, "There it is again. There is what love looks like without anything held back." Clara named her. She had been preparing the name for months, a fact she announced at the breakfast table the morning after. "I want her named Eliza," she said. "After Mama's mother, but also because I like it." Marcus looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at Marcus. Anne's mother had been named Eliza. Clara had known that and had held it and had offered it freely. This child who had opened the door to Ruth like she was expected, who had said, "I think you should stay," who had cried at the wedding and denied it. "Eliza," Marcus said. His voice held something that was not quite the same as any of the other expressions she had catalogued. It was something that had Anne in it and also Clara, and also the specific quality of a family that has moved through loss into something that is not the same as what came before but is whole in its own way. "Eliza," Ruth agreed. Eliza Ann Atkins was 3 weeks old when she opened her eyes and looked at the world with an expression of calm assessment that was so purely her grandmother Clara's gift to this family. That steady ancient gaze looking out of a new face, that Ruth laughed and cried at the same time, and Marcus held his wife and his daughter both and said nothing at all, because there was nothing that needed saying. By the late summer of that year, the house on Cottonwood Lane had become fully itself, the thing it was always going to be. It had 4 children's voices in it, and the smell of bread and coffee and wood smoke, and sometimes apple blossoms from the young orchard that was beginning to produce properly now small tart apples that Clara put up in jars every autumn with a systematic precision that Dorothy Patterson had taught her. Ruth had been principal teacher at the Redemption School for 2 years by then. She had 38 students and a proper assistant, and a new set of McGuffey readers that she had ordered from a publisher in Cincinnati, and a blackboard that was not from the previous decade. Marcus had the farm running well, the wheat and the small cattle herd and the orchard, and he had taken on a formal role as a civilian consultant to the federal marshal's office in Abilene, advising on cases in a region he knew thoroughly, work that brought him home at the end of each week, and that used the skills that 8 years of service had built without requiring him to be gone for the weeks and months that active service had demanded. Holly's Crane visited twice a year and ate at the kitchen table, and told stories about the early days that Marcus verified with additions and corrections, and that the children listened to with the focused hunger of young people absorbing history from people who were actually in it. Gerald Whitmore had been convicted in federal court in the autumn of 1883, sentenced to 12 years at the federal penitentiary in Kansas. His lawyer had appealed twice and lost twice. The land grants were formally voided. The names of the 2 federal surveyors were entered into the official record as having died under circumstances connected to his criminal scheme, which was not justice exactly, but was as close to it as the federal system of 1883 could manage. Ruth had testified twice more before it was finally finished, and she had felt, when the final verdict came through in a telegram to the Abilene Marshal's office, a release so complete that she stood in the kitchen and was simply quiet for several minutes, and Marcus came in and found her there and knew, and held her, and she let herself be held without any of the careful guardedness that had been such a thorough feature of her character when she arrived at this door. She was not that woman anymore. That woman had been necessary, and she was grateful for her, for the determination and the intelligence and the willingness to run when running was the only available option. But she had been the woman alone with a bag full of someone else's crimes, and a horizon that extended only as far as the next necessary decision. This woman had a horizon that was long and wide and open and full. In the autumn of 1888, on a Saturday in October when the cottonwoods had gone gold, and the sky was that particular high clear blue that Ruth now associated with the whole of her life rather than any specific season, she sat on the porch in the late afternoon sun with Eliza on her lap and Thomas running in the yard, and Clara at the kitchen table visible through the window, doing her arithmetic with focused intent, and Marcus beside her in his chair with his coffee and his easy quiet. And she thought about 6 years ago. She thought about a stagecoach coming into a town she had chosen for its distance from everything that had hurt her. She thought about a notice on a board in a general store. She thought about walking up a path to a door on a late October afternoon with her single bag and her secrets and her carefully managed fear. And she thought about 2 children opening that door and looking at her like they had been waiting. She thought about what Elias had told her once, the previous spring, when he was 16 and thoughtful, and had the quality of a young man who was beginning to understand his own history with some perspective. He had told her that the dream he had told his father about, the woman with red hair and a blue dress, had not been a single dream but several over several weeks, and that the name Ruth had come in the last one, 3 days before she arrived, and that he had not understood it as anything more than a dream until she walked through the door, and he had thought, with the simple recognition of the very young, "Oh, there she is. We were right to wait." She looked at Marcus now. He was looking at the cottonwoods with that face he wore in peaceful moments, the tiredness around the eyes that was no longer the tiredness of a man carrying too much alone, but the tiredness of a man who has lived fully. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He turned to look at her. He considered the question seriously as he considered everything. "I am thinking," he said, "that the October light in Texas is the best light there is." She looked out at the cottonwoods. The light was coming through them at an angle that turned the gold leaves nearly translucent, and the scrubland beyond was bathed in it, and the house behind them was warm, and the children were present and real and growing. "Yes," she said, "it is." He reached over and took her hand. Eliza, on Ruth's lap, grabbed his finger with both her small hands and held on with the fierce proprietary grip of a baby claiming what is hers, and he looked down at her with that expression, the open one, the full one, and Ruth thought, this is what it means to be home. Not a place you were born into or arrived at by accident, but a place you chose and that chose you back, a door that opened before you knocked, two children who had been waiting, a man with river water eyes who had laid a fire in a room for someone he was optimistic would arrive. She had come to ask about a room. She had found everything else. Outside, the golden cottonwoods moved in the October wind, and the mockingbird in the yard started up its complicated song of borrowed music, and the house on Cottonwood Lane held its people in the late afternoon warmth, and the day moved gently and without hurry toward its close. Thomas came running up the porch steps and threw himself against his father's knee with the specific urgency of a 4-year-old who has discovered something magnificent and cannot wait. "Papa. Papa, come see what I found in the orchard." "What did you find?" Marcus asked, catching him. "A caterpillar that is enormous," Thomas announced. "The biggest one ever. I need you to come see it right now." "All caterpillars are the biggest one ever," Marcus said. "This one actually is," Thomas said with absolute authority. Marcus looked at Ruth over Thomas's head. She raised her eyebrows in the direction of the yard. He smiled, the real one, and stood up with Thomas under one arm and went down the porch steps toward the orchard, Thomas explaining the caterpillar with escalating excitement, and Ruth sat in the afternoon light with Eliza and watched them go. Clara appeared at the porch door. "I finished my arithmetic," she said. "Come sit with me," Ruth said. Clara came and sat in Marcus's vacated chair with the self-possessed manner of a nearly 12-year-old who has decided that sitting with her mother is a choice she is making rather than something being asked of her, which Ruth understood perfectly and loved completely. "What are they looking at?" Clara asked, nodding toward the orchard. "An enormous caterpillar," Ruth said. "There are no caterpillars at this time of year," Clara said. "Thomas is not aware of that. Someone should tell him." "Later," Ruth said. "Let him have his caterpillar for now." Clara was quiet for a moment, watching her father and her brother in the golden orchard. Then she said, without looking at Ruth, in the offhand manner of a child who is saying something she has decided not to dramatize, "I am glad you stayed." Ruth felt the words settle into the whole of what she was carrying in that moment, the child on her lap and the husband in the orchard, and the boy she had taught to read, and the schoolhouse full of children, and the 6 years of mornings and evenings and meals and fences and letters and fears and joys and small, ordinary, perfect moments. "I am glad I stayed too," she said. Eliza grabbed a strand of Ruth's auburn hair that had come loose in the afternoon breeze and held on with both fists, laughing at nothing but the pleasure of it, and the October sun made everything gold, and the mockingbird sang its borrowed songs, and on Cottonwood Lane in Redemption, Texas, in the year 1888, the house that had once held only grief held everything else instead.